You were told a story when you were young: work hard, stay focused, show up every single day, give your best, and if you do all of that, if you really, truly put in the effort, you will be rewarded. You will earn more. You will build a better life. You will get ahead. That story was called the American work ethic. It was the foundation of the American dream, and for a specific window of time in American history, roughly from 1945 to 1973, it was actually true. If you worked harder and produced more, you got paid more. The math worked, the promise held. Here is the number that this entire video is built on. Since 1979, 45 years ago, worker productivity in the United States has increased by 62%. That means the average American worker today produces 62% more economic value per hour worked than their counterpart in 1979. More output, more efficiency, more contribution to the economy. Now here is the number that should make you furious. In that exact same period, the same 45 years, the median worker's wages, adjusted for inflation, increased by approximately 18%. 62% more produced, 18% more paid. Someone kept the difference, and today we are going to find out who. Before we trace the money, let us first establish what productivity actually means, because it is a word that gets thrown around without precision. Productivity, in economic terms, measures how much output is produced per unit of input. In the context of labor, it measures how much economic value a worker generates per hour of work. Productivity grows when workers use better tools, better technology, better processes, or acquire better skills. From 1947 to 1979, productivity and wages grew together at almost the exact same rate. Every time a worker got more productive, they got paid more. Then, almost precisely at 1979, the two lines separated, and they have never come back together since. Let us put some real numbers on the human cost of this gap. The median full-time American worker earned approximately $56,000 in 2023. If wages had kept pace with productivity growth since 1979, if workers had continued to be paid their fair share of what they produced, that median worker would be earning approximately $92,000 today. The difference is $36,000 per year, every single year for the median worker. That is not a rounding error. That is not a statistical abstraction. That is a car payment, a college fund, a down payment on a house, a retirement savings contribution gone. Extracted every 12 months from every median worker in America. Now here is something that reveals just how deliberate this gap is. It did not happen to all workers equally. The productivity wage gap is almost entirely concentrated among the bottom 70% of American earners. The top 1% of earners, CEOs, financial executives, major shareholders, have seen their compensation increase not just in line with productivity, but dramatically faster. CEO pay at S&P 500 companies in 1965 was approximately 20 times the median worker's salary. By 2022, that ratio had exploded to 344 to 1. The same economy, the same productivity growth, wildly different distribution. The economy did not fail to grow. It grew. The growth just stopped going to the people who produced it. The standard explanation offered by economists and politicians who defend the current system is what is called skill-biased technological change. The theory goes like this. Technology has increased the productivity of high-skilled workers much more than low-skilled workers. So it is natural and expected that high-skilled, high-education workers earn more while low-skilled workers fall behind. This explanation is partially true but deeply incomplete. It fails to explain why workers with college degrees have also seen wage stagnation. It fails to explain why countries with the same technological change, Germany, Denmark, Canada, did not experience the same wage divergence. And it completely fails to explain the explosion in CEO pay, which has nothing to do with technology. The first cause is the destruction of union bargaining power. In 1954, 35% of American workers were members of labor unions. Unions did one thing above all else. They gave workers collective bargaining power, the ability to negotiate wages as a group rather than as individuals. When a single worker asks for a raise and the employer says no, the worker has almost no leverage. When a union of 10,000 workers threatens to strike, the employer has enormous incentive to negotiate. That power, collective bargaining, is what kept wages rising in line with productivity for the entire post-war period. And starting in 1979, that power was systematically dismantled. The second cause is the shareholder primacy revolution, a fundamental transformation in how corporations understand their purpose and obligations. Before 1970, most large American corporations operated under what was called stakeholder capitalism. Companies felt genuine responsibility not just to shareholders but to workers, communities, and customers. Executive compensation was modest. CEO pay was 20 times the median worker, not because of regulation but because of cultural norms. Then came the Friedman Doctrine. In 1970, economist Milton Friedman published his famous essay arguing that the only legitimate purpose of a corporation was to maximize profits for shareholders. Everything else, worker welfare, community investment, environmental responsibility, was, in his words, socialism. The third cause is stock buybacks, and this is perhaps the most technically obscure but financially consequential of the three. Before 1982, stock buybacks were illegal in the United States, prohibited by the SEC as a form of stock price manipulation. And that is exactly what they are. When a corporation uses its profits to purchase its own shares on the open market, it reduces the number of shares in circulation, which mathematically increases the earnings per share, which drives up the stock price. This directly benefits executives whose compensation is tied to stock options and major shareholders. In 1982, the Reagan-era SEC under Chairman John Shad passed Rule 10b-18, creating a safe harbor for buybacks. Now let us connect all three causes into a single coherent picture. Union power kept wages rising with productivity from 1945 to 1979. When unions were dismantled, starting precisely in 1979, workers lost their ability to demand a fair share of what they produced. The Friedman Doctrine gave corporations philosophical permission to stop caring about worker welfare and focus only on shareholder returns. And stock buybacks gave corporations a specific financial mechanism to redirect profits away from wages and toward share price appreciation. Three forces, all pointed in the same direction. All arriving in roughly the same decade, the productivity wage gap was not an accident, it was an outcome, a designed outcome. Let us make this human. Take a registered nurse, one of the most essential workers in America. In 1979, a median registered nurse in the United States earned approximately $32,000 in inflation-adjusted 2023 dollars. Nursing productivity measured in patients treated, complexity of care, efficiency of treatment, has increased dramatically since 1979, driven by better medical technology, better training, better protocols. If nursing wages had kept pace with nursing productivity improvements, the median nurse today would earn approximately $55,000 to $60,000 in real terms. The actual median nursing salary in 2023, $39,000 for LPNS, $77,000 for RNS, a mixed picture that shows productivity capture has been uneven even within the same profession. Now let us look at the warehouse worker, because this category of worker is perhaps the most instructive case study of the productivity wage gap in action today. Amazon warehouse workers in 2023 earn a starting wage of $15 to $19 per hour, which Amazon has publicized as a generous minimum. But here is what Amazon does not publicize. Since 2010, Amazon has invested massively in warehouse automation and efficiency technology. Each worker today handles significantly more package volume per hour than a worker in 2010. The productivity of Amazon's warehouse operations has increased dramatically. Amazon's revenue has grown from $34 billion in 2010 to over $500 billion in 2023. And starting wages for warehouse workers in real inflation-adjusted terms have barely moved. Let us follow the money. If workers produced 62% more since 1979 but only received 18% more in wages, the other 44% went somewhere. The Economic Policy Institute, which has tracked this in detail, estimates that the annual dollar value of the productivity wage gap represents approximately $2 to $3 trillion per year transferred from the working class to capital owners. Capital owners are people who own significant shares of stock, real estate, and business assets. This is not investment income earned through risk and innovation. This is income transferred from people who work for wages to people who own things. The distinction matters. Working people created the value, owning people captured it. The financial sector's role in this transfer deserves particular attention. The financialization of the American economy, the process by which financial activities came to dominate corporate strategy, executive compensation, and economic growth, has been one of the primary mechanisms through which productivity gains were redirected from workers to capital. In 1980, the financial sector accounted for approximately 15% of corporate profits in America. By 2006, just before the financial crisis, it had grown to account for over 40% of all corporate profits, despite employing only about 4% of the workforce. Finance was capturing an enormous and growing share of the economy's total output while producing a fraction of the real goods and services that workers create. Let us now look at what has happened to the concept of a minimum wage, because it is perhaps the clearest and most undeniable evidence that the productivity wage gap is a policy choice rather than a market outcome. The federal minimum wage in the United States is currently $7.25 per hour. It has not changed since 2009, 15 years without adjustment. In inflation-adjusted terms, the federal minimum wage is lower today than it was in 1968. Let that land. The floor wage, the legal minimum that the most powerful economy in the history of the world says its workers deserve, is lower in real terms than it was 56 years ago. Meanwhile, productivity has increased by 120% since 1968. Here is another dimension of the same problem that rarely gets discussed: the explosion in non-wage compensation that has masked flat wages for many workers. Health insurance, retirement contributions, paid time off, these are forms of worker compensation that do not appear in the wage statistics. The argument that compensation has kept pace with productivity often rests on including these non-wage benefits. But here is the problem. Healthcare premiums have exploded, and most of that increase is simply the cost of paying for the same coverage at dramatically inflated prices, not an increase in actual value delivered to workers. So when economists say that total compensation has grown more than wages alone, much of that growth is just paying more for healthcare that costs more, not actual improvement in worker living standards. Let us look at what other developed countries did differently, because the productivity wage gap is uniquely American in its severity. Germany, often cited as a model, never dismantled its union system. The German model of Mitbestimmung, codetermination, requires that workers sit on corporate boards with voting rights. This gives workers structural power to ensure productivity gains are shared. The result? Germany experienced similar levels of technological change and productivity growth over the same period, but German wages kept pace with productivity far better than American wages. German manufacturing workers earn significantly more than comparable American workers, with better benefits, more vacation time, and greater job security. Here is the dimension of this story that almost never appears in mainstream coverage. The productivity wage gap has not just made workers poorer relative to what they should earn. It has fundamentally changed the psychology of American work. For most of human history, work carried an implicit promise that effort and reward were connected. You worked harder, you were rewarded more. That connection was the psychological foundation of the American work ethic, the cultural belief that hard work is inherently virtuous because it leads to material improvement. When that connection is severed, when workers observe that harder work, better skills, and higher productivity no longer lead to higher pay, the psychological and social consequences are profound and lasting. The political consequences of the productivity wage gap are now playing out in real time, and they are severe. When people work hard for decades and feel that the system is not rewarding their effort, they become susceptible to explanations that attribute their stagnation to external enemies rather than systemic causes. Immigration, globalization, cultural change, racial grievance, these become explanatory frameworks for a material frustration that actually has structural economic causes. This is not unique to America. Historically, wage stagnation and rising inequality have been among the most reliable precursors to political instability, authoritarian movements, and social fragmentation. The productivity wage gap is not just an economic issue, it is a democratic stability issue. So what would it actually take to close the productivity wage gap? The evidence from history and from international comparison is clear about what works. First, restoring worker bargaining power. This does not necessarily mean returning to 1950s style union density, but it does mean creating structures through which workers can collectively negotiate for a share of productivity gains. Second, reforming executive compensation to reduce the astronomical gap between CEO pay and median worker pay. Third, restructuring stock buyback rules to require that a share of profits be distributed to workers before shareholders can benefit from buybacks. Fourth, raising and indexing the minimum wage to productivity so it rises automatically as the economy grows. These are not radical proposals. They are policies that existed in various forms within living memory. Let us bring this home because none of this is abstract. If you have ever worked hard and felt that the reward did not match the effort, you were not imagining it. If you have ever felt that you were producing more value than you were being paid for, you were probably right. The productivity wage gap is real. It is documented. It is measured. It is the result of specific policy decisions made over a specific period of time by specific people with specific financial interests in making sure the gap stayed open. You did not fail to work hard enough. The system was redesigned in 1979, in 1982, in 1970 to capture the value of your work before it reached your paycheck. Here is what you can do with this information. At the personal level, stop blaming yourself for the wealth gap between what you produce and what you earn. That gap exists by design, not by your failure. At the consumer and investor level, understand that companies generating massive stock buybacks while holding wages flat are performing a specific kind of financial extraction, and that knowledge can inform how you invest, who you support, and what companies you choose to patronize. At the political level, understand that the minimum wage, union policy, executive pay rules, and stock buyback regulation are the direct levers that determine whether the productivity wage gap closes or stays open. These are not abstract political issues, they are your paycheck. The story we were told as children, work hard, get rewarded, was not a lie when it was told. It described a real relationship that existed in a specific period of American history when policy protected the connection between effort and reward. That policy was dismantled, the connection was broken, and in the absence of that connection, the American work ethic, one of the most powerful cultural forces in the country's history, has been effectively weaponized against workers. Their belief in the virtue of hard work has been leveraged to keep them working hard for wages that no longer reflect the value they create. Understanding this is not cynicism, it is clarity. And clarity is the precondition for change. If this video gave you language for something you have felt but could not articulate, share it. The productivity wage gap is real. It has a name, it has causes, it has solutions. And none of those things become part of public discourse unless people who understand them make them part of the conversation. Subscribe to this channel if you want the structural truth about how the American economy actually works, not the comfortable version, not the partisan version, but the accurate version. Leave a comment. Have you ever felt that your hard work was not being rewarded fairly? Because I genuinely believe that most Americans have, and most of them do not yet know why. I am Max. Stay informed. See you in the next one.